The forest trail narrowed where the canopy closed overhead, filtering the late afternoon light into shifting patterns across the leaf litter below. Along the trail, a troop of chimpanzees moved through the trees with the fluid, unhurried certainty of animals that had traveled this corridor every day for years. Their bodies moved between ground and canopy in a continuous negotiation with the terrain, knuckle walking across open sections, swinging through lower branches where the undergrowth thickened, pausing at intervals to feed or to check the position of others in the group. At the rear, separated from the rest by 20 meters of empty space, a young chimpanzee moved with a rhythm that did not match the steady progression ahead. She walked forward a few steps, then stopped, standing upright to scan the forest behind her with an intensity that made her whole body go still. One arm raised against a branch for balance, her eyes moving slowly across the shadows between the trees. Then another few steps, and another stop, her head turning in the deliberate way of an animal that is listening for something specific rather than simply being alert to the general environment. Dr. Marcus Webb had been tracking this troop for 6 days from the research station at the edge of the protected corridor. He had documented the infant's behavior shifting over 72 hours and had recorded the moment 3 days prior when the troop paused at a clearing near the forest edge where they found the body of an adult female. Through his binoculars, he had watched the young chimpanzee stay beside the fallen female long after the rest of the troop had moved on, sitting close, reaching out repeatedly to touch the body with searching, gentle hands. Now, as the troop reached a section of trail where the canopy broke and the group needed to descend to cross a shallow creek, the infant continued to lag. She would move forward until she was close enough to reach the nearest adult. Then something would pull her attention backward and she would stop, her arms dropping, a sound coming from her that was too soft for Marcus to hear from his position, but visible in the movement of her throat and the expression that crossed her face when she made it. He lowered his binoculars and reached for his radio. The infant showed no physical injury, no obvious signs of disease, but there was something in the quality of her separation and the way she occupied space, as if tethered to something invisible behind her, that made him uneasy in a way that 2 decades of primatology told him to pay attention to. The troop descended to the creek and crossed, the adults moving with practiced ease, the other youngsters clinging to their mothers' backs or following close at their sides. The young infant reached the bank and stood at the water's edge, her weight shifting forward as if to follow. Then she stopped. Her head turned once more toward the forest behind her. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see small tremors moving through her body. This was not the hesitation of a young animal uncertain about a physical challenge. This was something that looked more like waiting, like a vigil that could not be abandoned simply because the world was continuing to move forward without her. Across the creek, the troop was climbing the far bank, disappearing into the canopy. The infant took one step into the shallow water, then another. For a moment, it seemed she had decided to follow. Then she stopped again, and when she turned to look behind her this time, there was something so deliberate in the gesture that it was impossible to interpret it as anything other than what it was. She was waiting for someone who was not coming. Marcus pressed the transmit button on his radio. His voice carried the weight of a decision that violated every instinct about non-interference, but he had seen enough young chimpanzees fail to thrive after losing their mothers, some dying within days, others surviving physically, but drifting into a disconnection that made full recovery impossible. To know that the line between respecting wild processes and preventing preventable death was sometimes thinner than field protocols like to acknowledge. The troop had vanished into the canopy. The young chimpanzee stood alone at the edge of the water, still looking back at the forest behind her, her arms hanging at her sides, waiting in the way that very young things wait when they have not yet learned that some absences are permanent. The sanctuary compound sat at the end of a gravel road in a wooded section of central Tennessee, a collection of buildings and outdoor enclosures that had been operating for 19 years. The structures were modest, local timber, corrugated metal roofing, fencing that prioritized function over appearance. But the land they enclosed had been carefully managed to provide chimpanzees with something closer to forest than cage. The young chimpanzee arrived on an afternoon when the humidity pressed down with the weight of late summer in the Cumberland foothills. She had not vocalized during the 6-hour transport, had not struggled against the temporary housing. She had simply sat with her back against the wall of the transport crate, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, embodying a stillness that was not calm, but rather the absence of any expectation that resistance would change anything. For the first 3 days, she barely moved from the corner farthest from the gate, sitting hunched with her back to the fence, her arms wrapped around herself. She would eat only after dark, when the sanctuary had gone quiet. The veterinarian found no physical injuries beyond minor scrapes, nothing that would prevent full physical recovery. But she noted in her report that recovery of the body and recovery of whatever the infant was carrying inside her were operating on entirely different timelines. She slept in short intervals, never more than an hour before, jolting awake and scanning the perimeter of her enclosure, checking every time whether the absence she was carrying had somehow resolved while she was unconscious. Roy Callahan had been working with great apes for 35 years, at facilities on 3 continents, and he had seen this particular kind of shutdown before. The way severe loss could create a suspended state in which an animal continued performing the basic functions of survival while withdrawing from any genuine engagement with the world. He had learned over those decades that this state could not be rushed into resolution. Sometimes the most useful thing was simply to be present without requiring anything in return. And here is what made his approach unusual. Even among people who had spent their careers doing this kind of work, he did not try to comfort her. He did not offer food from his hand or make soothing sounds or attempt any of the gestures that human instinct tends toward when confronted with visible suffering. He simply showed up, every day, at the same time, and sat. On the morning of the 4th day, he entered her enclosure carrying nothing but a bottle of water for himself, sat down on an overturned crate near the center of the space, and began the routine he would maintain for the next 6 weeks, 3 hours in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. Just sitting. Sometimes reading from a worn paperback he kept in his shirt pocket. Sometimes watching the movement of light through the mesh ceiling. Sometimes simply doing nothing in particular. The first week passed with almost no acknowledgement of his presence, though the distance she maintained between herself and where he sat decreased by small, measurable increments each day. He never looked directly at her, keeping his body language open and relaxed, understanding that in chimpanzee social communication, a direct, sustained gaze carried meanings he did not want to convey. He let her determine the terms of whatever might eventually develop between them. In the second week, she began eating while he was present, waiting until he appeared absorbed in his book before moving to her food, but no longer delaying until after he left. He noted this, and did not comment, and did not change his routine. It was on the 16th day that she approached him for the first time. She crossed the space in a slow, deliberate walk and stopped just within arm's reach. He continued reading, keeping his breathing steady, letting her investigate at her own pace. She reached out and touched the sleeve of his shirt, feeling the fabric with her fingers. She touched the back of his hand, traced the lines of his knuckles with a fingertip. Then she leaned forward and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, inhaling the way chimpanzees take in information about someone they are trying to understand, and held the contact for perhaps 3 seconds before pulling back. He did not move. He did not speak. He kept his eyes on the page of his book, even though he had not read a word of it in several minutes. She examined him with an expression that contained more alertness than she had shown in all the previous weeks combined. Then she turned and walked back to her corner.
We have to hold the course.
She did not look at him again for the rest of the session.
Consistency and patience,
but something had shifted. Roy, after 35 years, recognized this without being able to fully articulate it. What had shifted was not trust. Exactly, trust would take much longer. What had shifted was possibility. The closed door had opened, just slightly, just enough. What followed over the next months was not simple and not linear and not without setbacks. She began to orient her existence around his presence, vocalizing softly when she heard his truck on the gravel road, settling almost immediately when he arrived. She began eating with more enthusiasm, gained back weight, started engaging with enrichment items. She would sit beside him during morning sessions and work through the pile of browse he left nearby, occasionally pressing her shoulder against his arm in a gesture that required nothing and asked nothing. Roy recognized the pattern and understood its danger. What looked like progress was in part the substitution of one attachment for another. He had seen it happen before chimpanzees, who formed bonds with specific caregivers that eventually made reintegration impossible. Animals who spent decades in managed care because the human relationship had filled a space that should have been held open for their own kind. He was not going to let that happen to her, so he began the slow process of withdrawal. He stopped entering her enclosure and began sitting outside the fence, instead visible, present, but not physically accessible. He watched her confusion shift into anxiety and saw the partial return of shutdown behaviors, and he held the boundary anyway. She would come to the fence and reach through the gaps,
shows the alpha male
her
is still
fingers
ranging
extending toward him, making the soft contact calls that chimpanzees use with individuals they are bonded to. He would sit on his side of the fence, reading his book, present but not crossing back. Other staff questioned whether this was necessary. Roy held his position. He had been here before, and he knew what came next. The shift came on an afternoon 6 weeks into the new routine, when she had been moved to a larger enclosure adjoining the main rehabilitation area where 3 other young chimpanzees spent their days. Roy was sitting outside her fence. She was watching him from near the shared wall. Then one of the other chimpanzees, a female, slightly older, 2 years at the sanctuary, approached the shared fence line and extended her arm through the mesh. The infant looked at Roy. Then she looked at the other chimpanzee. After a long moment, she turned away from where Roy sat and touched her hand to the outstretched hand on the other side of the mesh. Brief, exploratory, not quite grooming, and not quite play, but it was the first time since her arrival that she had reached towards something other than a human. And Roy wrote about it in his notes that evening in more detail than the event itself seemed to warrant. He understood what it meant. He understood what it made possible. Integration unfolded over the following months in small milestones. The first time she initiated grooming with another chimpanzee. The first time she engaged in reciprocal play. The first time she was observed sleeping in contact with one of the others, their breathing gradually synchronizing in the afternoon heat. Roy continued sitting outside, watching from a distance as she built the relationships that were beginning to replace the attachment she had formed to him. He noted the day she stopped turning toward the sound of his truck. He noted the day she appeared not to register his arrival at all, absorbed in a grooming session with the older female at the far end of the enclosure. He did not expect to feel the loss of it. He did anyway. He sat outside her fence that evening longer than he needed to, the Tennessee light going orange and then purple through the mesh. Not reading his book, just sitting with the specific weight of having done something correctly and feeling the cost of it anyway. After 35 years, it still cost something. He was not sure whether that was a problem or whether it was the whole point. By the time she had been at the sanctuary for 8 months, staff began discussions about release. The protocol required confirmation that she could forage effectively, respond appropriately to the social communication of wild chimpanzees, and show no signs of human habituation. Roy argued for moving forward. The next stage of her recovery would only come from engagement with chimpanzee society, operating according to complexities that could never be replicated in captivity. His position prevailed. She traveled to a protected forest corridor 300 kilometers from the sanctuary with one companion from her sanctuary group. Roy did not accompany the transport. His presence would only complicate her adjustment. The clean break of his absence was easier to process than the confusion of seeing him there in a role she no longer needed him to fill. The soft release used a platform structure built in the forest canopy, a secure base where the two chimpanzees could acclimate to the sounds and smells of wild forest while maintaining somewhere to retreat to. For the first 3 days, they barely moved from the platform, sitting together in the body posture that Roy would have recognized from her earliest days at the sanctuary. On the 4th day, a wild group of 18 chimpanzees passed through the corridor and paused. The contact lasted nearly 2 hours, wild individuals approaching and withdrawing in careful turns, the orphans calling back in vocalizations that shifted between mild arousal and genuine uncertainty. Then the wild group moved on, but something had been established. A first point of contact. A beginning. The platform gates opened on the 6th day. Short excursions at first, longer ones as confidence grew. Integration with the wild group happened through the accumulation of repeated encounters across weeks, each slightly more familiar than the last, until the newcomer's presence had normalized enough that the wild chimpanzees simply moved on with them included. The final separation from the platform happened without a clear turning point. The orphans spent more time in the canopy, then began sleeping in the forest, then one day did not return at all. The release team's final report noted that both chimpanzees had successfully integrated and showed no signs of human habituation. The young female had become, in the language of the report, simply another member of a wild chimpanzee community of approximately 40 individuals. Roy received this news by email during his lunch break, sitting on the same overturned crate where he had spent those early weeks. He read it twice. Then he set his phone down on the crate beside him and looked at the enclosure in front of him, which currently held a new arrival, a juvenile male who had been sitting in the far corner since yesterday morning, his back to the gate, not eating. Roy watched him for a while. Then he picked up his worn paperback, found his page, and began to read. 3 years after the release, Roy had occasion to visit the forest corridor on a consultation for a separate project. On the 3rd morning, he rose early and walked the trail along the boundary of the protected area, watching the sunrise reach through the canopy, listening to the forest assembling itself out of the pre-dawn quiet. He heard the chimpanzees before he saw them below, rolling vocalizations of a traveling group, movement through branches, the occasional sharp call of a youngster in the middle canopy. The group emerged from deeper forest and moved parallel to the trail, feeding as they traveled. A community of approximately 20 individuals ranging from large adults to several infants clinging to their mothers. Most of the group paid him no particular attention, maintaining the mild indifference of wild chimpanzees that had learned humans near this trail were not a threat. But one young female, moving at the rear of the group, stopped. She descended partway from the canopy to a branch perhaps 8 meters above the trail and sat there, oriented toward where Roy stood on the path below. She was about the right age, the right size, but Roy knew that chimpanzees in a wild population looked more alike than people expected, that his memory of her face had been softened by 3 years of distance.
This is where the journeys of redemption
He stood
begin
still and let her
and
look.
end.
She watched him with an attention that felt specific, deliberate, rather than casually curious. Her arms were relaxed. She was not alarmed. She was doing something that looked more like considering, weighing something whose components he could not see. The rest of the group had moved on. She was separated from them by perhaps 50 meters and increasing. He could hear them in the canopy ahead, their sounds receding. He wanted to make the soft contact vocalization he had used during those early sanctuary weeks, to see if she would respond in a way that would tell him something definitive. He did not do it. Whatever she had been to him 3 years ago, she was something different now, embedded in relationships and routines, and a social world that had no place for him. And reaching back across that boundary would serve nothing except his own need to know. So he stood in silence while she sat on her branch and he stood on the trail below. And they occupied the same section of forest for perhaps 4 minutes without either of them moving. Then she turned, climbed back up through the canopy with the easy, flowing movement of an animal entirely at home in her environment, and disappeared in the direction the group had gone. He heard one brief vocalization from somewhere in the trees ahead, soft, low, the sound of a chimpanzee signaling its position to those traveling nearby, and then she was gone. He did not know whether she had recognized him. He did not know whether the moment of stillness on that branch had been what it felt like from the trail below, or whether he had simply been the most interesting stationary object in her field of vision on a quiet morning. The ambiguity felt right. It felt like the correct shape for an ending to a story that had always been about helping someone move beyond the need for you, about creating conditions for a life you would not be part of, about measuring success in distance rather than proximity. If it had been her, then the fact that she had paused but not descended, had looked but not reached, had turned back toward her group rather than lingering at the boundary, meant that the work they had done together had become exactly what it was always meant to become. A bridge, something you cross once and do not need again. He walked back to the research station through the morning forest, listening to the sounds of the chimpanzees receding into the canopy ahead of him, carrying the weight and the satisfaction of not knowing which was. He had come to understand over 35 years of this work, the closest thing to a right answer that this kind of work ever offered.